19 past the hour. Tomorrow, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance will be heading to Capitol Hill as the Trump transition team prepares for the confirmation process. And as we've been reporting, one of the most controversial picks so far is former Congressman Matt Gaetz, who Trump tapped for Attorney General. Joining us now, Congressman Adam Smith of Washington, ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, it's always a pleasure to see you. I thank you. It's been nearly a week since Trump announced Gaetz as his pick for AG. You served on the Armed Services Committee with Gaetz. What's your take on him?
Well, I mean, the more important take here is on what it says about the nominating process. And look, Donald Trump has made it clear, certainly since the insurrection in 2020, that what he expects from his fellow Republicans is blind loyalty. He doesn't expect them to question his decisions. So I really expect at the end of the day that all of his picks, including Matt Gaetz, will be confirmed. Now, we'll see. I mean, there's pushing the envelope here, but that's kind of the point. The point is to make sure, as he said with then FBI Director Comey, that the loyalty is to Donald Trump. And if you're willing to ignore all of the red flags around Matt Gaetz and confirm him, well, that confirms the loyalty. So that's the play right now. Look, I worked with Matt in the Armed Services Committee. He's smart, intelligent, clearly articulate. We had many very interesting debates back and forth. Primarily, Matt has been a showman. I mean, he's been in Congress to get attention more than he's been in Congress to do things. I'm not sure how that translates into leading the Justice Department. But again, the point here is loyalty to Trump. Republicans signed up for this, so I'll be interested to see if they're willing to challenge him at all. I sincerely doubt it.
Yeah, and you talk about this number of red flags on his specific case. What are you seeing as the biggest red flags?
Oh, gosh. That's hard to pick. Certainly, as you've noted, I mean, if there were a history of sexual misconduct or an allegation of that, that would be disqualifying in most instances. But look, I mean, Matt has made no bones about the fact that he thinks the government should absolutely serve Donald Trump more than it serves the American people. Matt has said, he wants to go after that enemies list as much as Donald Trump does. So our concern about whether or not Donald Trump's going to use the presidency to prosecute people who have disagreed with him, former members of the military, members of the Biden family, members of the Biden administration, Matt is going to be all in for that with considerable enthusiasm and his trademark sharp wit, without any question. Will he be interested in running the Justice Department on behalf of the American people? I don't think that's supposed to be the focus of Trump's Justice Department.
And Congressman, I want to turn to the war in Ukraine, where it seems the Ukrainians wasted no time utilizing U.S. long-range missiles to attack inside Russia after apparently the Biden administration gave the okay to do so. It comes as Russia announces it's lowered the bar for when they can use nuclear weapons. How dangerous of a moment are we in right now?
No, I think it is. I think it is dangerous. And I know a lot of people had been criticizing the Biden administration for a long time for not sort of giving Ukraine just the complete ability to do whatever they wanted. But the stakes are high here. I personally don't think that we are at risk of a nuclear conflict. I know people feel that we might be. I don't think Putin wants to do that. I don't think it's in his best interests. But look, Putin is also supporting armed forces in Yemen. He's working with Iran in different ways. There are ways to attack directly U.S. interests that Russia can support. And I think as we get more aggressive about targeting Russians in Russia, then those risks go up. All that said, I support the president's decision here because Russia is trying to obliterate Ukraine. All right, they are using the North Koreans, they're using Iranian support. This is a major threat to any sort of freedom and democracy in the world. We need to help Ukraine defend itself to force Putin to stop his brutal war on the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's really important what you did is outline who are Putin and Russia's allies around the world. And we're talking about the cooperation with Yemen, Iran, North Korea, Cuba. I mean, these aren't exactly poster children for, human rights activists. But I want to ask you, Congressman, about this NBC News exclusive reporting that the Trump transition team is compiling a list of current and former senior U.S. military officers who were involved in the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and exploring whether they could be court-martialed for their involvement. This is all according to a U.S. official and a person familiar with the plan. What do you make of that?
Well, I wonder if Donald Trump's going to court-martial himself. I mean, he was the one who launched this plan, okay? He was the one who made the deal with the Taliban, keeping the Afghan government completely out of the deal, promising the Taliban that we would be completely out of Afghanistan by May 1st, which, as Trump points out over and over again, bought us 18 months of peace whereby the Taliban weren't attacking U.S. troops. But when May 1st, 2021 went away, they were going to start attacking us. He put the Biden administration in an impossible position because of his decisions. So I think he ought to court-martial himself because of those decisions.
And the 13 American service members that were killed, the more than 100 Afghans that were killed, the aftermath of that bombing, which killed an innocent family. Those specific issues, however, are not under Trump's purview.
Fair enough. Look, it was an impossible situation. I challenge anyone to go back in history and show me an example of where someone lost a war in a clean and easy way. Our mission in Afghanistan had failed. Personally, I think we should have pulled out a long time before that. I think we were not going to be able to do what we wanted to do. Once we got to the point where the Taliban were pushing into Kabul and we were trying to get out, I just don't think there was any easy way to do that. Mistakes were clearly made, no question. That has been investigated over and over again, as well it should have been. But anyone who thinks that there was some simple way to pull out of Afghanistan, or worse, that we would have been better off if we had stayed, it is an absolute tragedy that we lost the lives of those 13 service members. How many more service members would we have lost if we had stayed? If the Taliban had continued their attacks and we had actually been there? So I hope we don't oversimplify the difficulty of what was involved in getting out of Afghanistan.